Autopsy doctors of Reddit, what was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Just a warning guys, obviously as you can probably tell, this one gets pretty intense, so you have been warned. Worked at an animal hospital. They did necropsies for zoos all the time. An alligator died and they shipped it to the hospital, refrigerated it, etc. to stop the decay. They took it out and put it up on the table. After doing all the paperwork, they started opening up the alligator. After the first cut, the alligator opened its eyes. Turns out it wasn't dead. The zoo vet mistook an illness for death and the low temperature put it basically into a coma. Unfortunately, this is all the information I know on the story. It's been 7 years since I worked at that place. This reminds me of a guy in Florida that was picking up dead iguanas. It had gotten so cold they would fall out of the trees dead. Except they weren't dead and sprung back to life as they warmed up in his car. He crashed but was fine. That is crazy. I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had died from an overdose on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth and it was full of blueberry muffin mix, and it was in his throat. Turns out he got just high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix and he ended up choking to death. I initially misread this as you put your finger into your own mouth to verify that it was blueberry muffin mix, and I gagged. I did the autopsy of both a robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle, and the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their fourth lumbar vertebrae shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. Just so you guys know, I'm not an expert with all these pronunciations, so bear with me if I do get some wrong. During my internship rotation a couple of years back, a 40-year-old guy came in because he suddenly collapsed while drinking with friends. He came in unresponsive, mouth bleeding, and not breathing, so we had to intubate him. For some reason, the endotracheal tube, the stiff tube placed inside the trachea to help the patient breathe, won't go in, but we managed to suction copious amounts of blood clots. After CPR, still with unsuccessful intubation, so we had to bag him with a face mask, the patient was declared dead and diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. During the autopsy, they found out that the guy was apparently shot by a gun from the top of the head. The entry wound was obscured by his hair and was barely bleeding at all, and the bullet somehow went through the back of the guy's throat and made a hole behind the base of the tongue, which the endotracheal tube kept slipping into. What? Training in the medical examiner's office, elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs, dissected everything, completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as the last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom, giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. I'm single and happy being single, and honestly I think about that scenario too often. Choking on my food, dying alone in my apartment, my cat eating my face. That's not a good thought to think often. Not a doctor, but a whole body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases, normally overdoses. Had a mid-30s female, went to medical examiner prior to donation, but they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus, found a condom full of pills. Similar to most, the body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec, easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. My theory is she was going to start carrying drugs that way, but wanted to practice with something that wouldn't kill her first. This is actually a really good theory that I never thought about. It would explain a lot, though she appeared to be a heavy drug user, so I'd figure she'd have some amount of street knowledge. As a student in the medical field, I had the opportunity to visit a cadaver lab. I was very surprised to see how many people had died from choking. Out of the 12 or so cadavers in the lab that day, at least 7 or 8 were from choking. I went home and immediately looked up how to perform self-Heimlich. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the surgeons, medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. Last casualty of the Vietnam War. This was actually in the 90s, a bit before I was born actually. This does make me wonder if there's a possibility for other Vietnam veterans or Korean War veterans to possibly have a similar situation or straight up lead poisoning, or in the future if there's a chance for this to happen to Iraq or Afghanistan veterans. I was a forensic tech for a state medical examiner's office for about 2 years. I've assisted in about 1,000 autopsies and have removed bodies from scenes from likely twice that. I told these stories in another askreddit thread about people who clean up crime scenes, and I have a few takeaways. Man who had a psychotic break and castrated himself and stuffed it all into his mouth before cutting his own throat. Man who was sodomized to death with a broom, a baseball bat, and the tuning end of a guitar. Man who decapitated himself by hanging himself with high tension cables and jumping off a bridge. Woman overdosing while carrying an 8-month pregnancy. Not really any major revelations, like in terms of something wild, unexpected, or a medical finding that contradicts the police report. Just seen enough in one lifetime for 100 people. That was insane and gross. Jeez. Med student, almost graduated here. A couple years ago, I attended the pathological anatomy course, and during a class, the professor showed us some autopsies. Despite the tremendous smell of 4 or 5 consecutive autopsies, one of them was carried out on a homeless patient that died in the ER, probably due to heart failure. The body had massive ascites, fluid in the abdomen, so at first he had to evaluate it. Imagine him cutting the abdomen and the yellow rancid liquid started to come out like a fountain. One of my colleagues fainted. Then the next step was to examine the abdominal organs. Imagine the face of every person in the room when it became clear that the patient had some form of inherited polycystic disease, and the liver and the kidneys were full of cysts. The liver weighed more than 10 kilograms, normal weight 2 to 3 kilograms, and the kidneys almost 3 kilograms each, normal 150 grams each. The professor was really shocked at the beginning, but then he really enjoyed cutting through the cysts in order to get samples. They popped like air balls, spreading liquid all over the place. Second colleague fainted. The other ones were pretty standard, but I think I will remember forever this one. In particular, that liver on the scale. I even took a picture, but I can't find it anymore. I'm kind of glad that you can't find it. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy, no success. Then they did a whole scan, X-ray or CT, of the upper chest, abdomen, pelvis. No bullet. At that point, someone said, fuck it, let's scan the whole body. Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa area behind the knee. It had embozzled, travelled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee, where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. How the f does a bullet even fit inside a blood vessel? I don't want to know that one either. 6 months after my aunt's passing in a drunk driving incident, the coroner decided to ring up my mum and inform her that they completed their report on her passing and deemed the likelihood of suicidal intentions which may have factored into said incident. I initially didn't understand how coroners could deduce such a thing until I remembered self-harm scars are a thing. My mom had only just gotten the acceptance stage of grief, and it put her family back to square one. She's fine now.